Welcome back to Face the Nation. Perhaps one of the most surprising enterprises for a former prisoner of war in Vietnam were Senator John McCain's efforts to make peace there and his partnership with a fellow veteran and protester of that war, Massachusetts Democratic Senator John Kerry. Kerry writes about it in his upcoming memoir, Every Day is Extra.
I write a lot about John McCain and my journey in reaching back to Vietnam, because that story is a story of keeping faith with soldiers. It's a story of keeping faith with the American people, but it's also a story of two guys who had a different point of view about a major event in American history, who found a way to come together. So a POW and a protester found a way to be able to make the system work and to work together and find common ground. What's happening in the country and the notion that my journey, I believe, is relevant to how we try to fix our country. How, you don't just speak out, which I did quite forcefully, but you work to implement our democracy by reaching out across the aisle, by building relationships, by believing in the better angels of American value system. And I think John McCain did that. It's the journey we all went through, where Vietnam tore the country apart. John McCain and I had differences in how we found each other's common ground on an airplane flying to Kuwait.
You said that was one of the most consequential conversations of your entire career in
Absolutely.
Congress.
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, because it resulted in this partnership, which sometimes had tensions, but which got things done.
You say at one point you even played with the idea, at least, of
we sat
partnering
down,
with him
we
as
sat
a
down
running
and
mate.
talked, but there were difficult issues to try to work out. We kind of flirted, but didn't go on a date. He's an incredibly courageous and strong individual. He's a very special patriot.
We'll hear more from former Senator Kerry about his book, Every Day is Extra, next Sunday on Face the Nation and CBS Sunday Morning. We'll be right back. My predecessor at this desk interviewed John McCain not just for this broadcast, but he spent hours one-on-one with candidate McCain as a reporter when he was on the Straight Talk Express back in 2000. Joining us now from Chicago is, of course, John Dickerson. John, thank you for joining us this morning. I know you spent
Great to be with you, Margaret.
You spent so many hours with the senator. What was it like to be part of that campaign?
Well, the campaign was the message of the McCain presidency. He started out, as he said, so low in the polls that with the margin of error, he might actually have been in negative territory. And he's famous and being lauded now, but back then he didn't have a shot. He was running against the establishment of his party. He was running against George W. Bush, who had all the money and all the endorsements. But what McCain basically said is Washington is corrupt, there is too much money in Washington, and my campaign, by taking on the establishment, will show you what's possible in Washington, where we can break down the fact that money has influence on all pieces of legislation. And it's kind of extraordinary to think back about that. He was in the Senate, and he was essentially saying that all of his colleagues were corrupt and that he himself had been corrupted by money. The fact that he then was able to take that long shot campaign through was evidence that his message could work and was paying off with the voters.
And as you say, and I know you've written about this, that the senator was upfront about his own flaws. It wasn't something he tried to hide.
He was, and this was something that when, in the, millions of interviews I must have done with town hall, people who went to his town halls, over 114 of them, I believe, in New Hampshire in 2000, and then again, he did the same thing in 2008. He would be very frank about his failings. The Keating Five, being caught up in a campaign finance scandal, was in part what motivated him to be so ferocious about trying to get money out of politics. And this is why when people talk about his character and his discipline and his honor, it is a durable kind of character. In other words, it has scuff marks. It has been out in the real world. It's not encased in some glass case and unreal. He failed a lot. He talked about his failures. He beat himself up about his failures, and even when he was off course, he was often trying to get back on course, which is why so many people looked at his life on the campaign trail and thought this is a model for the way politicians should behave, but also the way we should behave.
And reporters spend so many hours with candidates, as I know you did, some of them off the record. I know you've said that you sometimes had to sort of guide the senator to go off the record because he was so colorful in some of his storytelling.
Well, you know, one of the things, and his candor got him in trouble in 2000. Some of the days you'd be in conversation with him over 9 hours. And so that this was, of course, in the sort of internet, everything is covered every second kind of way. And in the service of trying to make a larger point, he would sometimes shorthand things in ways that wouldn't look good if you spliced the comment. But you know what got through to voters when they saw him, curious about this person. He was a celebrity candidate not since Ronald Reagan that we'd seen in 2000, but it was celebrity that had behind it this durable thing. And the thing that was durable is what had sustained him for 5.5 years in a dark box. It wasn't just running on his gaudy name. He was running on a set of values. And when he talked about it, he talked about the people he'd served with. He talked about the connection of their duty, honor, and service in very difficult times, and connected it to real-life Americans at the moment. And then he said this to his audience. He said, there are still great causes. Whenever there's a person who's poor, that's a great cause. Whenever there's an old person who lacks insurance or lacks hope, that is a great cause. And he was trying basically to make this transaction to say the things that allowed me to get through those 5.5 years of torture and giving up the right to be released early, what got me through that can still sustain you now. And that's what made people stand up and applaud for those ideas, even if they disagreed with him, which they often did in those town halls.
And yet, at the end of his career, he was still a maverick, going toe-to-toe sometimes with President Trump, the head of his own party. Do you see any voice out there like McCain's right now who's willing to take the chances you described?
In the conversations I've had since his passing, there are a lot of Republicans, a lot of people who think that this is not just the dying of a Senate icon, but the dying of a set of principles. But I think McCain would argue against that. And you argue we should just note, the way he used to sometimes go after this legislation was the way he used to box at the Naval Academy. They said he would just run into the middle of the ring and start throwing punches. And he, sometimes that worked and sometimes he got knocked on his behind. But the always getting up is the key thing in McCain. But in terms of whether that still exists, I think his argument would be all he did was plug his life into a set of American values that have been with the country since its founding. The idea of self-sacrifice. When he got out of prison, he didn't talk about his great deeds. He talked about the deeds of all around him. Not taking credit for yourself, recognizing the dignity in other people, recognizing even if somebody is in another party, they're still human beings. All of those things are available to all Americans. And while John McCain had a life trying to follow those and sometimes falling them short, everybody can plug into that. That would be his message. So while there may not be one person, I think his argument would be there are a whole nation full of people who have all of those same qualities that they can grab a hold of and live a life that might measure up at the end of it the way people are saying John McCain's did.
The better angels still live. Thank you very much, John Dickerson. We will be right back to hear more from some journalists who also knew and covered John McCain throughout his Senate career. For our political panel this morning, we've gathered 3 writers from the hometown paper, so to speak, here in the nation's capital, the Washington Post, to talk about Senator John McCain. Dan Balz is the chief correspondent covering national politics, the presidency, and Congress. Michael Gerson is a nationally syndicated columnist, and columnist Karen Tumulty wrote the paper's lead story this morning on the life of John McCain. And Karen, I know you'd been working on this for some time. You had amazing anecdotes in there. One that stood out to me was McCain as a child, you said. He had such stubbornness. He once held his breath until he almost passed out.
He actually did pass out. I think his personality became clear very early, and he would have these tantrums where he would hold his breath until he passed out. And his mother went to a Navy doctor who said, next time that happens, just take him fully clothed and drop him in a tub of cold water. So that's how she would deal with it.
I don't think it worked. I don't think that really changed the character. You know, John Dickerson, our colleague there, was sharing what he had heard, which was last night in Arizona as the senator's body was being taken from his home. There were people just gathered on the side of the road saluting him one last time, sort of an informal tribute to John McCain. Mm-hmm. Dan, you know, we talk a lot about the sparring he's doing with the current president, mm-hmm. but there is still that deep respect that is coming there, and you saw last night in Arizona.
I think you're seeing it everywhere. I mean, not just from politicians and the kinds of statements that we're hearing from everyone who's had their life touched by John McCain. I got an email from a friend this morning who's up in upstate New York who was at a diner for breakfast, and people were talking about McCain there and what a patriot he was. So, I mean, I think his impact goes way beyond just the pure political system. I think people look at him for what he was, which was a patriot and an American. And I think that set of values is something that I think people find in short supply today, and they look at McCain's life and his example and they think we need more of that.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of desperation in some of this, that we don't have it in as much as we need. This is a time when we need heroes, and this is a hero passing from the scene. So I think there's a bittersweet element to this. He was the polar opposite to the president on many things, and really played that role.
I also think that what we're seeing here is the passing of a generation when it was expected that our national leaders would have early in their lives served. And you know, John McCain is one of the last of that breed too.
Yeah.
You heard John Dickerson say that some Republicans he had talked to referred to this as the dying of a principle, not just the dying of a patriot, but that McCain would have rejected that description. What do you make of that?
I think he would have rejected it. I think he viewed America in a certain way, through a certain lens, as a place of ideals and principles, not just a land, not just a piece of property, but the carrier of a human ideal. And this is what he talked about. The reason he was critical of a lot of current foreign policy was, you know, he was a voice for oppressed people around the world. He could have just been a hawk, you know, and a defense hawk as a senator. And he spoke up for the people of Vietnam. He spoke up for the people around Asia who knew his name from Radio Asia. This is someone who cares about me. And that was really a great role that he played about, you know, extending American values.
It was certainly a role he put himself in the past year since the election of President Trump. I'm thinking of him going to the Munich Security Conference and standing up in front of European allies despite being, you know, not feeling well, and saying basically, don't forget us, and I'm going to stand up for Western values. America is still here. Who is that voice now?
I think it remains to be seen who that voice is, but I also think it is much more difficult to do what John McCain has done throughout his life in the current era we're in. I mean, one of the things I think his passing represents is the passing of a certain era. I mean, he operated at a time when he had principles that he lived in ways that other politicians didn't, and yet at the same time, there was a greater acceptance of the kinds of ambitions and values that he was trying to represent, i.e. working across party lines to get things done, recognizing that compromise is a way to get progress, an ability to have fights with people and move on. We're in a different time. It is a much more, as we've talked a lot about, it's a much more poisonous time politically. I think that Senator McCain's passing reminds us of how difficult it will be for someone to step into those shoes.
And Karen, the president is not part of this tribute, and that was a choice being made by the McCain family. What do you make of that?
I think that this president and John McCain are just polar opposites in so many ways. And one thing is in the sort of code of honor with which John McCain lived. It both defined him and it haunted him. The lowest moments of his life were when he betrayed his own principles. When he, in Vietnam, it wasn't being beaten and having his arms broken, but it was signing a forced confession, vague, that admitted to black crimes. To him, that was the single low moment. And I think we don't see, Donald Trump prides himself on never apologizing for anything, never looking back. That is the exact opposite of John McCain, who was always sort of trying to perfect himself to the point where he could live up to his own code of honor.
You wrote about that, saying it pained him to think that that moment of breaking might have hurt his father and caused him great embarrassment. And yet he used that to go on and fight his own party, even at times, on this issue of enhanced interrogation techniques and torture.
He was, and it was, he was John Sidney McCain III. He was named after his father and his grandfather, the first two men in the history of our country to go on to become four-star admirals. And then the weight of that name and what it represented also was just part of who he was.
I also think that the invitation to President George W. Bush to give this speech is an important one. You mentioned torture. They disagreed about that. This was one of the toughest rivalries in American politics.
It was a pretty tough fight they had.
I was on the other side of that, McCain Express in 2000. We thought it was going to run us over. And it was
you were a speechwriter.
Yeah, but over the years, McCain and George W. Bush have talked on the phone quite a bit. And even more in the period during his illness.
About what?
I think about old times, former football players, that talk about old rivalries. But it became very warm, I think a genuine friendship. And Senator McCain asked President Bush to give the eulogy months ago as he was thinking about who he wanted at his own funeral. So I think it's a sign of reconciliation in a lot of ways, a good one.
He asked George W. Bush, he asked Barack Obama, the two men who really defeated him in his bids for the presidency. I mean, what is the message that the senator was going for in choosing those two individuals?
Well, I think the message is, personally, he always moved on. I mean, he didn't live in yesterday with all of its recriminations.
And yet President Trump.
Yeah, we moved on to the next stage, and I think that this represents that. I mean, both of these were rivals, but these were the kind of rivals where they believed the other side was going to serve the country. They had different views, but similar goals, and I think we're losing some of that.
The conflict with President Trump is interesting because from President Trump to John McCain is personal attack. He's not a hero just because he got shot down. That's the way he has gone at that. John McCain has opposed President Trump on principles. Mm-hmm. President Trump says America first. John McCain is country first. There's a real difference in that. And I think that that's the way each of these politicians has approached the way they try to do their jobs. And I think it says everything about the difference between the two.
And in that final memoir of John McCain, he talks a lot about what President Trump has really represented, some of those threats that he says to that country first principle, the nativism he talks about, his frustration with the inability to get immigration reform through, his frustration with the country in many ways, but he is still an optimist.
He is an optimist, he's a realist, but I think that at his heart he is a fighter. And he's a fighter for the principles that he has believed in. I mean, this notion of fighting for a cause larger than yourself can sound corny and cliched. Mm-hmm. He lived that. And I think that that's why the battles that he has been engaged in, both before President Trump and currently with President Trump, flow out of the same set of principles.
And Karen, one of the things that perhaps sticks in the president's mind, not only the vote on health care, but also, and he writes about this in The Restless Wave, is the decision to receive this so-called Steele dossier when he was in Europe, and to be the one who brought that to the FBI and hand it to Jim Comey.
But that really was Senator McCain doing the responsible thing. And again, very much of a contrast with the meeting in Trump Tower, where a foreign adversary is offering the Trump campaign dirt on Hillary Clinton, and they take the meeting. Senator McCain's impulse was to turn it over to law enforcement.
And he writes about that was why he chose that, the justification for it. And yet in this environment, it is filtered as just a political choice, not one of principle here.
Yeah, I mean, but so much of it, everything today is filtered through that political lens. And people will, there are people who take issue with John McCain for a variety of reasons. And whenever there is a moment in which John McCain is in the news, those people come out to trash him. But as I say, I think that the way McCain approached his life and approached everything he did was to stand up for America, to stand up, as Mike said, for oppressed people, for the underdog, and to keep fighting and even when losing, to get back up and keep going.
Senator Flake of Arizona, when I asked him, who takes up this mantle, said, there are many people who can. There's a very real question: who takes Senator McCain's seat in Congress, and who will, in this upcoming primary race that's also being fought right now in Arizona, ultimately take the seat that Jeff Flake is retiring from? Who literally takes the mantle?
Well, I don't know that we can say that anybody can take the mantle. Someone can fill the seat, but that's quite different from taking the mantle. And I think that has to be in the heart and soul of other people as they watch these last days in which we will be talking about John McCain day in and day out and thinking about the example that he had. It will be up to others to try to summon up some of what McCain has represented and see if they can take it on.
Is it overstating things to call it the death of romantic conservatism, as some have?
Well, I do think there is a generational element. I was with John McCain in the last days of the 1996 campaign. During 96 hours where we went straight, Bob Dole went straight. He was going to lose, Dole was going to lose, but the person who rode on the plane with him was John McCain. And we were at a bowling alley at 2 a.m. where Dole lost his voice, and McCain had to provide that voice. And the points he made about service and sacrifice in praising that generation brought everyone to tears. It was just extraordinary. Who has the ability, the standing to be that voice? And I think that's an open question.
And yet I think that if you look at his concession speech in 2008, where he was actually celebrating the moment that the country had reached, even as he's conceding defeat, he was a remarkable man.
He was, and I know we will all be watching as he is honored this week. Thank you for sharing your stories about him. And thank all of you for joining us this morning. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. There will be continuing coverage of the life and legacy of John McCain all this week here on CBS News and on our digital network, CBSN. Until next Sunday, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.